In reading, the mind is in fact only the playground of another's thoughts. Author Schopenhauer. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm Jacob Shamansky. There's something about fall that makes us want to settle down and take it easy for a while. Nobody makes big plans around this time, and that leaves us with lots of time for audiobooks. AMI's Ramya Amuthan is with me. Rams, in the time that I've known you, I've noticed that you seem to lean very heavily on seasonal reading and, books that really fit into specific seasons. I've never been fully on board with that type of thing. I want to know your perspective on this. Like, how does that work for you?
Well, sometimes it's just as basic as setting, right? Like you want to read wintry books in the winter, which a lot of people then default to Christmas books or holiday reading of different kinds. It's the same thing going back to Christmas movies or watching Hallmark all through the holiday season. But to me, that can happen any time of the year. I love reading summary books during the summer, anything that takes place with just summer being described, the weather or the vibe and things like that. I feel like it's just meant to be read at that time.
I'm picturing somebody reading or listening to an audiobook on their balcony in the dead of summer, and you're sweating like a pig, but in your book it's also like the dog days of summer.
Yes.
And you're in it, right?
That's
like
right.
I remember having an experience reading the Farseer trilogy, and the third book of that series, it's a long journey drudging through the snow in the far north, and I read that in the depths of February last year.
Yup, exactly.
And it was glorious.
It
I don't know. It really meshed, right?
It does. It feels like you're there. And I can't remember the book that it's called Deception Point. Deception Point, I read it in the middle of winter, and they're just like exploring the Arctic, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. People are getting buried in the snow or crushed by ice. And I'm just like, ooh, yeah, it's chilly.
We're not alone today, though. Karen McKay is the communications manager at the Center for Equitable Library Access. We've had her on multiple times, but she's here to join us in this discussion of cozy books that we can read in the fall. Karen, how's it going?
Great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Do you want to share with us your perspective on seasonal reading? Is that something you can relate to?
Well, I'm kind of like Ramya. I like to read in the season in which I'm existing. So I like wintry kind of books during the winter. But I also, when we chatted about just what we were going to talk about today, I realized there's a real seasonality to the kinds of books that I read, especially sort of late fall into early winter.
Oh, yeah.
Which I hadn't really contemplated before. But yeah, there really is a very distinct set of books that I return to, or that I look for if I'm looking for new ones. So I'm interested to hear how you guys sort of come to...
Okay, wait, tell us. I think that would make a great jumping off point, because I think similarly to me.
So I think I've shared before that I tend to read more nonfiction than fiction. And this time of year in particular, that seems to be the case. So I have a few like Christmas books that I go to. One of them is called Calm Christmas by Beth Kempton. And it's all about sort of preparing for Christmas, but not in the to-do list or whatever. It's a little bit more, it's not religious, but there's a bit more spiritual to it, and a bit more sort of taking care of yourself during Christmas. There's a bit more of understanding how Christmas intersects with family traditions and with religion and with our expectations around, giving and all that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit deeper. The book is excellent, but the woman also, her name's Beth Kempton. She also does a podcast, which I highly recommend. She has this really beautiful sort of lilting British accent, and she's just like, even if you don't pay any attention to the words she's speaking, just having to read to her is just lovely.
That's cozy.
Yeah, it's very cozy. And so, she shares different readings, some poetry, some, thoughts for reflection. She's an author, obviously. She's written a number of books, so she often will give like a prompt for if you want to do some journaling. But she shares like family stories and stuff. I love her, especially this time of year when things feel like it's, things are starting to spin a little bit out of control. Yeah. It's like taking a little British holiday. And it's just lovely. So I highly recommend her. And the book is called Calm Christmas, and we have it in our collection. But her podcast is also called Calm Christmas, and I, highly recommend it. And I listen to old recordings of hers, like just while I'm, if I'm doing something, cooking or something, and yeah, love that. The other thing I noticed about my own reading is that I tend to go towards books that talk about creativity and sort of living the kind of life that that I want to live. And I find it interesting that it happens at this time of year, often because things are kind of crazy. But I think it's kind of wrapped up a little bit in, the reflection that comes as we have New Year's and sort of you've come out of the summer where things maybe you're not sort of being as reflective, like you're sort of just enjoying the moment. Or at least that's the case for me. And out of the early fall season where things are always quite focused on sort of the outside world. So I read books. I go back to books like Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, who also wrote Eat, Pray, Love, which folks may remember.
Great book.
Yeah. And it's so Big Magic is one of those books that you can just kind of dip in and out of. It's not set up really in chapters. It's more like little snippets or sort of short little vignettes or stories. And it just sort of sometimes will help me kind of orient towards the things that I want to be paying attention to, or things that I feel like I'm not being able to incorporate into my day-to-day life. So I love that one. And the other book that's kind of around creativity that I really like to go to is called Making a Life, Working by Hand and Discovering the Life You're Meant to Live by Melanie Fallick. And it's about 5 years old now. And Melanie Fallick, she used to be an editor for one of the book companies that did a lot of books around fabric arts, like fiber arts and knitting and sort of that conduct of life element. But this one is more about why we create, what drives humans to connect through the work of our hands or through writing or music, to sort of make those connections in our lives. And again, it's just one of those books that I go back to. You don't have to read it in one sitting. There's, chapters. You can just read a page or two.
Just take bits and pieces.
Yeah, just little bits. And for me, the creativity part, especially as I get older, is becoming more and more something that I want to integrate into my day-to-day life. And so I find myself going back to these books or looking to these books, or in that sort of category of books to, I don't know, just it sort of buoys me up. It helps me find my place in the world, which I think good literature does. But these are nonfiction books. So those are ones that I tend to go back to a lot. And I have some more to talk about, but I want to hear what you guys think.
Okay, well, my initial reaction is it's interesting. It feels very self-care and reflection. But also, when you say you go back into these books, the word I thought was for the wisdom, right? Like it's a kind of like some of my stream on Instagram with these shorts and when I used to be on TikTok was just this stuff, not books though, but this kind of thing. And there are certain days when you're just more in tuned with wanting to learn, wanting to reflect, wanting to just go back to some wisdom that somebody's shared in some particular capacity that you could just take away and say, okay, I'm going to implement that into my life. And you're saying around this time, that's true for you.
Exactly. And so this is a time where I tend to do a lot of like creative kinds of endeavors around Christmas gifts or getting together with girlfriends or whatever. Like it's just, that's sort of in my life at this time of the year. But I want kind of the broader perspective and the grounding pieces, not just the how-tos or even sort of the light, why we use, why it's important to create. Mm-hmm. I want the stuff that really sort of speaks to how it connects us to one another. And so those are things that make me feel quite cozy, is to sort of think around that kind of experience about what is it that, feeds me that I want to bring into my life at this time of the year.
Well, what it sounds like is it's the right thing at the right time for you. It's the comfort zone at the time that you most need comfort with it, which I think you mentioned that the fall ends up being some of the most hectic.
Yes.
I don't know if it's because of work, but it does kind of feel that everything seems to launch and take off around the fall, right? Mm-hmm. But Rams, I want to hear your perspective. Like how would you define a cozy book for yourself?
So for me, cozy is like this stuff that Karen you're touching on feels a lot of more like soul searching, which comes to me later in the winter. The dead of winter and going into spring, where I'm just like, what? Oh my gosh, are we
Who
all
am I?
doomed? Yeah.
What am I doing?
What am I doing here? Who am I? Anyway, but then the cozy part of it is now. Like it's late fall into winter. I find I am so ready to I don't want to take in anything serious. I just want to be cozy. Like it's that same feeling of I just want to eat carbs. you know when the winter's coming and you're just like, don't, just give me the soup and the mashed potatoes and the macaroni and cheese. Like I just want to eat carbs and listen to Harry Potter all day. That's what this is. It's like that rainy day hunker down cozy
That
feel.
sounds really nice.
It is
So
awesome.
Is Harry Potter a cozy book for you? Like, why is that?
1000%. You knew that was
Why?
coming, right?
Yeah, but why though? Dig deep. I want to know.
Because the same way, Karen, you talked about that narrator, forget what she's talking about, but it's just she puts you in that lovely headspace. That's what Jim Dale does to me. That's what going through Hogwarts through their seasons does to me. Now it's book 3 and book 6 specifically because there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of like relationship fun and dynamic, and there's not a lot of dark in those books necessarily. So I go back to those books, but it's not just those books, by the way. I'll still read It by Stephen King every couple of years, which everyone's like, why would that be a cozy read?
Right.
I know. It's controversial, but the reason is because it's long. All right. It's like 36 or 42 hours or something like that. Ridiculously long. He gets into the details of everything of this little town, of the people, of the stories. He flips back and forth. There's a lot of childhood stuff being explored, which reminds me of my childhood, right? Just like horseplay and silliness and tough times too. But all of that feels either nostalgic or comforting. It doesn't always have to be nostalgic, but it's very much comforting because you feel like you could just relax and daze away into something. There's not a lot of heavy thinking going on. That's the reason why I pick up books to begin with, because there's this whole controversy, right, around whether or not you should reread at all. People like Kelly MacDonald, because I have to shout him out. He said this so many times on air already. He just can't believe that people would spend time rereading books and over and over and over again the way I do with Harry Potter. Just like it. Do you guys?
Well, rereading a book is because you're already familiar with it.
Yes.
And so it's an easier read. And when a book is a relatively easy read, I'd argue that makes it a little cozier. Now, I kind of agree with Kelly in this case because there's so many books out there that you could be reading that it's
FOMO?
hard to FOMO, exactly. It's hard to motivate yourself to reread something when you have so many things you'd like to read already. I don't know about you, but I have dozens of books.
Sometimes I'm like, I'm tired. Like I need to go back to it's what you said, a familiar place to reset.
I think there's also the idea that as you develop and grow, you read the book differently every time you come to it. See new things. Yeah, or the perspective changes. Like books I read as a kid, and I'll just throw these two out. I asked some friends and some colleagues what books they pick up, and the overwhelming responses at this time of year, the overwhelming responses were Anne of Green Gables and Little Women, and they go back to it from. I think everybody goes back for comfort reasons, but also a few of them said, every time I read these books, I read them with a different lens. And so like as kids, we read them and we related to the younger characters in those books. But as adults, we might relate to them, from the perspective of like the mother in Little Women or, just different perspectives on these books. And they feed us differently each time. They give us new things to think about. And so I think that's one of the reasons that folks return to books is that it helps them center on who they were, but it also gives them a bit of an insight on who they are now and who they're becoming and the things they're thinking about. So I'm a rereader as well. Sometimes it's because I don't want to put the mental energy into paying attention to every detail. I just want to be in that space, like enveloped in the plot or the setting or the characters. And they're friends. It's like going back and having, having a conversation with a friend. Yeah. So I'm a rereader.
Their stories are your stories. right? Like
Exactly.
when we connect with each other on books, it's almost that same feeling when you're going back and connecting to those books. I'm like anticipating fun scenes that are coming up, fun stories that are coming up. I'm like, I'm gonna pause here because this time tomorrow when I'm in bed, I want to get to this chapter. Like
Oh my
it
God,
gets
you
serious.
dork.
It is so I know. And you know what? Another book that I want to mention in on this level is Born to Crime by Trevor Noah. So it is full of stories, right? All he does in that book, I mean, it's a memoir, but he tells so many stories. Like you could just divide story by story by story and revisit them. And some of those stories, man, like especially in the summer when he's talking about his summers growing up or like his time growing up in South Africa, I'm like, oh, can Trevor tell me that story again? And I'll just go back and read.
Do you think there's an aspect of nostalgia in this? And this is a question for both of you. Like when you're rereading a book, does it take you back to the first time you read it in the headspace that you were when you first read it?
Oh
And in
yeah.
that sense, it can be comfortable?
Sometimes, and sometimes it takes me back
Hmm.
to the times when I was reading it to my children when they were younger, and
Oh.
that's
Mm.
also part of the nostalgia as well, is like watching them meet these really important people in my life for the first time for them, which is part of it. And part of it, they just like the stories themselves hold really good memories. Like I'll throw this one out. We were listening in audio to some of the Stuart McLean stories. We were traveling for Christmas Day, and
Hmm.
we were listening to his Christmas CD. And there's a couple stories in there, like besides Dave cooks a turkey, they're beautiful Christmas stories, but they've become part of our family stories, our family
Yep.
lexicon. Like there was one that we were laughing so hard that my husband literally pulled over. Like he cannot drive and laugh this hard. And it's partly because we're laughing with all the kids, right? So it, I do think that there's a lot of nostalgia, that there's, those books that are cozy, I think, there's a warmth contained in either the stories themselves or our connection and our memories that we do want to revisit, particularly, I think, at this time of year.
Hmm. But definitely that other aspect too of just the headspace you were in when you first read that book. Like I'll never forget bawling on Toronto's public transit when spoiler alert, high spoiler alert, when Dobby dies in book 7 of Harry Potter. And so every time I know I'm getting to that bit, I'm like, oh God, it's happening again. And I will flash back to that time. And that's happened to me many times with many books. Dave Brown, who we've had on the show here before, he would recommend a book based on, his reaction to a particular part. He's like, this book made me sob in public, and so you should pick it up. I'm not going to tell you which part, but you'll know when you get to it. And that was the reason why I picked it up. And now I think of Dave crying in public every time I get to that part of a book, right? Like it's just kind of interesting to compare notes that way as well, or connective. But I do get very sentimental like that, Jacob. Do you?
See, that's a good recommendation. If somebody told you that it moved you to tears, like I want
Yes.
to know why.
Yeah.
If it doesn't move me to tears, then what does that say about me?
Yeah.
Do you get sentimental about books? Not really, because I'm not a rereader, to be honest. If what I want to
You
do more
saved
than
that for
anything
like
is
2/3 into the
read
conversation to
books.
be like, oh, by the way, I don't reread. Tell
Well,
us all about it.
I don't reread because there's so many things I want to be reading, and a lot of the books that I read, and you already know this from you, and I don't know if you know this about me, Karen, is that I read a lot of fantasy, and those books tend to be long. I can't commit hours of like 10, 20 hours
Oof.
of my time rereading fantasy books. I'll
Not
do
even
read
your
if it's like
absolute
5 hours.
favorites.
Not even my absolute favorites. The way I will re-experience them is by going online and reading people's reviews and reactions to them.
Oh,
That's
Hmm.
I can kind of live vicariously through other people's first experiences of a book. And I brought up nostalgia earlier, and I don't mean to say that if you feel nostalgic about a book that like negates its value. Like I'm not saying that nostalgia like disqualifies it from being a genuinely powerful book. If you can harness nostalgia as an author, or if a book elicits nostalgia out of you, that's perfectly valid. I didn't mean to like
Right.
to downplay it or anything like that. Now, I wanted to talk about cozy reads, but what makes a cozy read specifically, and we've already mentioned a lot of things, but I think something that seems to be a running theme here is that there's familiarity and it's typically an easier read. And this kind of plays into something I wanted to bring up today. And that's that there's this perception that reading books is often this intellectual exercise, and reading books is something smart people do. And I want to push back on this because reading is entertainment, like a whole lot of other things like movies and films. And it's just a pleasant way to spend the time, like any other form of entertainment. And I think we're being disingenuous when we're getting involved in these reading challenges on Goodreads and things like that and saying, oh, I read 200 books in 1 year. And just because you feel like that's what smart people do, you're so much better off reading what you enjoy. And it doesn't matter if that's a cozy read, because you don't gain anything from pretending that you're doing this because you're smart and you're looking to, gain knowledge and stuff like that. Like, if you find comfort and entertainment and it's just a good way for you to pass the time, then that's a good enough reason for you to read. And if that means you only read 20 or 30 books a year,
20 or
then
30.
So be it. Okay, I guess that's kind of a high number.
After all that,
if you can read like 5 or
That's a
6 books a
numbers game.
year, but you digest the books properly, you read them like one chapter at a time and properly take them in, I would say that you're engaging with the books more than the people that are reading 100 books a year, because there's quantity over quality, right? You can digest books and really dig into them. Are you guys guilty
good hot
of
take.
that at all? Speed reading. Is it a hot take though?
it's can be if you're more of a what I quoted you as being an academic reader, But it's true though. I think because we've talked about this before over the summer, right? Reading light summer romances versus I don't know, like something with a deeper storyline. When we reviewed a book earlier this year, half of us were like, "This was awesome," and the other half was like, "It didn't have enough for me." And it's true. I think sometimes people are looking for depth and intellectual reads, and other times it's not necessarily the case. So cozy reads can feel taboo, but it doesn't have to be.
Right. It's kind of like sometimes you talk to people and they're like, you tell them, hey, what do you like to read? And they kind of embarrass and go like, I like
Yeah.
schlocky romance.
It's like when
you
we
don't
label
need to
things
be
as
like that. It's like
100%.
nobody's embarrassed about watching movies.
Yeah.
Right. It's the same thing. It's just, I think it's so pretentious when people roll their eyes when you say, oh, you read fantasy, oh, you read romance, or you read like
Or when you
cozy
have to
mystery.
start reading like making things sound like guilty pleasure reads because
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
lighter and cozier. Yeah.
Exactly. There's just this whole attitude, and I see it all the time online. But it has to do with how challenging a read is. Because what cozy reads, in my opinion, if I had to define it, like a cozy read is something that you don't have to think that hard about it. But on the other side of the coin, some books are so challenging that they're just incredibly frustrating and kind of pretentious. Because I think pretentiousness is when an artist expects too much out of you. And if a book is so hard to read,
Interesting.
then the author kind of did something wrong, right? If it's incredibly difficult to read, part of that is on the author.
I have to ask, is this coming from a personal place for you? Like, did you give up on a book recently?
I'm reading a very challenging book right now, and it makes me feel dumb. I enjoyed it, but
And
I
so
feel like
you
a lot of it went over my
Take
head.
this platform to air your grievances about this author. You're not going to shout out the author though?
A little bit. I was kind of scratching. Yeah, I'm reading. I forget the author's name though. The series.
not
It's a
worth
fantasy
mentioning,
series called The
did a bad
Dagger
job.
and the Coin by I think his name is Andrew Abraham, and it's a fantasy book that involves a lot of themes of like medieval banking. And it was really complicated. I had a lot of difficulty getting it. And I told myself, like, I thought I would like this, but it just went over my head. And for a long time, I was like, I don't understand this. I feel dumb. And then afterwards, I was like, no, if this is a good author, he would have made it easy to understand.
So I picked the topic of cozy reads, but Jacob was like, I need to bring this up in some way or another. This is going to be the angle. It's good.
Well,
It
I
works.
think he's right. Like if you don't connect with whatever the thing is, the setting, the plot, the theme, the language and vocabulary. If you can't connect with the book, it's not going to feel cozy. It's going to feel frustrating, or it's going to feel
1000%.
like a slog, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I have a sort of a personal thing that if I'm not connected to a book by page 50, basically, forget it.
You're out.
There's not enough time in the world to read books that I don't love. The caveat to that is if somebody has recommended it to me and says, the first bit's a slog, but stay with it because it's really great towards the end, then I'll continue. But yeah, I think that Jacob's right. Like, we have to have some sort of basis for connection, and
Agreed.
we also need to feel good in some way, whatever that looks like with a particular book. It needs to evoke some sort of positive feelings, which is why I think we need to normalize things like, reading beach reads whenever you want to read the beach reads, and not being embarrassed about things like romantasy or science fiction, or, like the kinds of books that you can get at, airports or at Shoppers Drug Mart or whatever, that are just, they exist to create a world. And if you like to be in that world, then there's no shame in
And
that.
people love that world. That's why these books are so popular. And like Nora Roberts, and I can't remember her alias version of this, but she just cranks out the books, and it's formulaic and it's light reads, and people love it and they want more. And it's exactly what you're talking about, that feel good, right? Sometimes for me, I don't even remember the book. I talked about this book a couple of weeks ago on the show, Big Little, and I have no idea what the book is about. I just pick it up whenever I feel like just being soothed almost, and it's like fantasy-ish. There's a lot that just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not even trying to keep up with whatever's going on, but it's cozy, it's beautifully written, and it could be gibberish, but it's so poetic. It's kind of like The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. I felt very similarly about that book, where by the end of that book I was like, I don't know what this was about at all, like, but it doesn't even necessarily need to make sense to me. It just felt so nice.
Did that not bother you?
No,
it didn't bother you. Didn't fully understand it.
It's kind of like, I accept that this was a bit of a delusional experience or something. Like, I didn't need to fully connect with it. It wasn't nonfiction. It wasn't that I needed.
It was
to
a
take
fever
notes.
dream.
Kinda. It's strange to say that, but yeah, I feel like this is going to be a bit of a topic we can get into later. But yeah, it's sometimes I leave books thinking I didn't fully grasp the intent. Like, I can't go online and interact with other people on what this was about or why, but I could just say, like, yo, it was so beautifully written. It was so poetic. Remember this line? Like, just go back and read it. It's nice.
This was all a bit of an aside, and all that to say that you shouldn't feel bad about what you read, and you shouldn't feel bad if you don't fully 100% comprehend what the author was going for, because if you keep reading, you're going to get better, and all you really owe yourself is reading something that you enjoy and spending your time the way you want it, because you don't need to read.
And if you didn't like the book, just blame the author.
Yeah, just blame the author. It's not your fault. You don't owe the author anything unless they paid you to give you a good review.
Oops. Yeah. Caveat.
As we wrap up here, Karen, do you have any final thoughts on cozy reads?
Just find books that speak to you, as you said. Find books that you love, and you don't need to make any excuses or justify to anybody, even yourself, why you love it. If you just love the feeling it evokes in you, even if you don't understand what happened in it, read it, enjoy it, love it.
Yeah.
I think that's all the time we have, guys. Thank you so much for doing your research into this. I know we were all looking forward to talking about it. This was really fun. I'll talk to you both next time.
Thanks so much.
That was Karen McKay. She's the communications manager at CELA, the Center for Equitable Library Access, and AMI's Ramya Amithan. That's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. You can find a repeat of AMI Audiobook Review as part of AMI Today on AMI Audio every 6 hours. The show is also available on your favorite podcast platforms, and that includes YouTube. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. Have a good one.